Welcome to the December webinar, a collaborative presentation of the Federation for Children with Special Needs and the Recruitment, Training and Support Center, RTSC. I'm Mary Beth Landy, the Training and Support Specialist for RTSC. Today's webinar is Implicit Bias, Cultural Competency, and the Delivery of Appropriate Services, presented by Marlene Sallo. Marlene is the Executive Director of the Disability Law Center. She has worked in the field of advocacy for the rights of children and youth with disabilities involved in foster care and the juvenile justice system. I'll let Marlene tell us more about herself. So welcome, Marlene.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So during the webinar, please type your questions into the toolbar and we will try and answer the questions during the presentation. Past webinars, as always, are archived on the RTSC website, along with many resources on trauma, learning, and educational issues that impact student and children welfare. So let's begin.
Hey. Good afternoon, everyone. As indicated, my name is Marlene Sallo, and I'm currently the Executive Director of the Disability Law Center here in Boston. I have over 30 years of experience actually working on behalf of children and youth with and without disabilities, mainly minority youth, both involved in the juvenile justice as well as foster care system. Today, the discussion that I plan on having with all of you is based on a world of experience dealing with different issues across the East Coast in the variety of states that I've worked in and actually come in contact with. So I'm hoping to provide you with some overall information, and I welcome any and all questions that you may have. So if you like, I'll go ahead and start. So the presentation is actually titled Implicit Bias, Cultural Competency, and the Delivery of Appropriate Services. And I'd like to just provide you with an overview of not only the historical, foundation for the child rights and the court system and how they deal with children's rights, but also to give you a general idea of how which human and civil rights protections exist for both children and youth, and then kind of trickle down into the child welfare system, juvenile justice, mental health. Overall, what does the general data tell us and where do we go from here? Once I get to that point, I more than hope that everyone will have questions, because I'd like for this to be a dialogue towards the end of the presentation. So I'm going to start off with child protection and the history of it. So if we go back to the year 1875, right, during colonial times, there truly was no organized child protection system. So basically, it was every person for themselves. And then between 1875 and 1962, we actually saw not only the creation of, but also a growth in organized child protection systems through what they called non-governmental child protection societies. In other words, the government, right, wasn't really infringing upon the rights of individuals, but they did have an organized system to try to look out for kids. And then finally, in 1962, we had the era of what they called government-sponsored child protective services. So before we had these agencies established, what we saw was that parents could be prosecuted for any abuse against their child as early as 1642, specifically in Massachusetts. So in Mass, we had a law that actually gave the magistrates the authority to remove kids from their parents. And the train of thought was they were removed if the parents did not train up their children properly. And then in 1862, what we find is that Massachusetts passed a law. And under this law, it authorized judges to intervene. And so they were able to intervene based on a reason of orphanage, or because the judge felt that there was neglect, crime, drunkenness, or some other vice that the parent or parents were exhibiting. And so they felt that if this was present, that it could be said that a child would end up growing up without education or any statutory control, or in circumstances that expose that child to what they called an idle and dissolute life. And so basically they're looking at, we need to make this child productive, a citizen, and so we're going to intervene if we feel that something's getting in the way. But then we have 1866 also in New York, and we had Henry Bergh. And he actually established the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. You're probably thinking, well, what does that have to do with us? And this is something that we even learned in law school, is that animal protection existed before child protection in and of itself across many states. So you push forward, you have these laws that technically they can cite to make sure that there are protections, but it's not until 1875 that we have the world's first organization that's developed and which devotes itself entirely to protection of the child. And this came into existence in New York and under the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. And if you look on the side, I had like two different quotes, and I think one of the most striking quotes to me is the bottom one, where it says, "It is not alone the lower animals that are subject to ill treatment and cruelty," and that's where that connection came in, right, between animal rights and children's rights. But you have to ask yourself, like, what actually led to New York, right, taking the first step to establish an organization? And it was actually this young lady. Her name is Mary Ellen McCormack. And she was beaten by her mom. And her quote, this is what the young lady said when she testified in 1874. She said, "Mama has been in the habit of whipping and beating me almost every day." And that's at 10. She further stated in court, "She used to whip me with a twisted whip, a rawhide. I have now on my head 2 black and blue marks, which were made by Mama with the whip, and a cut on the left side of my forehead, which was made by a pair of scissors in Mama's hand. She struck me with the scissors and cut me. I never," sorry about the typo, "I never dared speak to anybody, because if I did, I would get whipped." So here is this child, a 10-year-old child, actually in a courtroom testifying to this. I mean, for all we know, maybe other children might have spoken about the abuse that they felt at the hands of the mom, but this in a New York courtroom really brought home the need to protect our kids. So as a result of this, we start seeing after the 1862 Child Protection Society showing up across the country. But through this popping up, we also have what starts to appear as what we call the Juvenile Court. And actually, the first Juvenile Court was established in Chicago in 1899. And after that, the juvenile courts spread quickly. And by 1919, all states but 3 had juvenile courts within their jurisdiction. Then everyone kind of falls into line. And then you have the thought about reforming juvenile court, which fast forward to 2018, and we're still thinking about that. So when they created this court, they had primarily the thought of delinquent children in mind. And they wanted to not only allow the juvenile court to intervene in delinquency, but also in abuse and neglect. And in some jurisdictions across the nation, you have what they call family court. And so sometimes the family court, unified family court, might have juvenile court as well as child welfare put together and heard by the same judge. Other times you have divorce court with child welfare heard by the same judge. So we've had different iterations of the original establishment of the juvenile court across the US. But nonetheless, juvenile court remains a central player in most jurisdictions, unless the jurisdiction separates child welfare into family court, and then delinquency remains in juvenile court. So if we look at the history about juvenile justice, what we see is that during the 18th century, we actually had punitive measures that were established against kids across the US. And these kids were charged if they committed criminal offenses. And at that point in time, we followed English law. Specifically, they viewed kids 7 and under as being infants. And so the presumption was that they were incapable of forming any time of requisite intent to commit a crime, right? So if they did something and it could have been viewed as criminal, we couldn't say that that was their intent to do that. For kids over the age of 14, they were presumed to understand everything they were doing, so they were tried as adults, sentenced to time in adult prisons, or even worse. Sometimes they were actually sentenced to death for the commission of a capital crime. So prior to the 1900s, at least 10 children were executed in the United States for crimes committed before they were 14 years of age. I mean, think about that. Before they were 14 years old, you had 10 kids, at least 10 kids executed for a crime. And this can be viewed as a violation, it should be viewed as a violation of the nation's 8th Amendment, which is the right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. Now, as it applied to children between the ages of 7 and 14, there was what they called a rebuttable presumption that the children were incapable of formulating the intent in order to commit a crime. So the prosecutor pretty much had to show that the child knew the difference between right and wrong, and then the child could be convicted and sentenced to a longer sentence, even to the fullest extent of the law, which might mean that they're charged as an adult between the ages of 7 and 14 if the prosecutor was successful, which is pretty striking if you think about it. When kids were convicted, they were actually confined in correctional facilities. And in these facilities, they weren't separated from adults. So you actually had men, women, and the mentally ill all placed in the same facility, which nowadays, based on the research that we know that that's uncalled for. It doesn't make any sense. And the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act, which was reauthorized, by the way, recently after 16 years, prevents that through the sight and sound exception. So when we start thinking about the first juvenile court, we see that it actually served as a social service agency. And it went about doing that because it actually tried to identify the needs of the youth and also to provide services for all the kids that were identified as either being at risk and being juvenile offenders. And we had a great judge. His name was Judge Julian Mack. And if you look over on the right side, he has a great quote. And I always share this in any presentation that I give because I think it really brings home what many of us feel. And that is, why is it not the duty of the state, instead of asking merely whether a boy or girl has committed a specific offense, to find out what he is physically, mentally, morally, and then if we learn that he is treading the path that could lead to criminality, to take him into charge, not so much to punish as to reform, not to degrade, but to uplift, not to crush, but to develop, to make him not a criminal, but a worthy citizen. So imagine if everything we did in juvenile court, whether the child is in child welfare or in juvenile justice, we think about building the child up rather than tearing the child down through punishment. So I leave that thought as we move and continue through this PowerPoint. So Judge Mack was one of the first judges to ever be appointed to serve in the Chicago juvenile justice system, and he truly advocated for the rights of the child because he felt that every child had the opportunity and should be given the opportunity to grow up to become a worthy citizen. Obviously, the definition of that could differ depending on who is choosing to define it. But he established what he called detention halls that were home-like. So it didn't make the kids feel like they were being punished. But here's a concept, right, which I would argue ties into the multidisciplinary approaches. He had parents, he had local merchants and employers who he felt were also responsible for the moral upbringing of the child under their care, to kind of come to the table and have those discussions with the idea of providing them with opportunities and also breaking up the gangs by turning the gang members into what, once again, they called law-abiding citizens. Then in Denver, we actually had Judge Benjamin Barr, and he wrote a statute which established the juvenile court in Denver. And so from 1900 to 1927, he actually was the presiding judge over this model. And what he did was he applied what were general theories that the offender should be protected as a ward of the court, and that we should provide treatment for any problems that the child presented rather than punishing the child, that we should be objective about how we deliver these services, and that the delivery of services should be equitable. So we take this concept and we start putting it all together, and as we're moving forward over time, all of these concepts, I believe, have worked towards setting into play or into place some of the current civil rights protections that exist on behalf of kids, right? So we have Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that, you know, protects anyone against discrimination based on race, color, and national origin. But that works hand in hand with the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act of 1964 as reauthorized, right? Short for MIPA. And in the foster care system, both of those, Title VI as well as MIPA, work hand in hand to make sure that the placement of the child is not racially biased. And I'll get more into that later, but we did see for a while there that folks that were actually placing kids into foster care thought they were doing right by the child, but technically speaking, it was discriminatory in nature. And so I'll address that in a little bit. We also have the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, otherwise known as CAPTA, the Fostering Connections to Success. We're, for those of us that work in foster care, advocate on behalf of kids for educational purposes as well. We tend to use that a lot. ICWA, otherwise known as the Indian Child Welfare Act, that's also found in foster care. You can have a lot of biases that seep into your work if you're not following ICWA or if you're applying it incorrectly. We have IDA, which is very important, and IDA is not just for learning disabilities or physical disabilities, it's also for behavioral and emotional, as well as any other need that the child may have. You have the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, so we're trying to prevent kids from being homeless and having continuity of educational services. And then we have the JJDPA Act, which I previously mentioned. So I've been using this cartoon thing, I don't even know what to call it, it's for about 12 years. And for me, this pretty much encompasses what our kids are faced with, right? We have kids in school, you'll have the alternative instructor or what we call indoor suspension guys saying, hey, you know, we can't afford to save this one, but don't worry, someone's gonna catch him. Is it gonna be the alternative school? Is it gonna be gangs? Is it going to be the judicial system, or is it going to be the welfare system? And unfortunately, with a lot of the kids that I've worked with, they've come in touch with every one of these systems, and sometimes they've been dually involved in both welfare as well as judicial system. So when we say youth involved in the system, we're saying child welfare and/or juvenile justice, predominantly youth of color, and I mean racial and ethnic categories. Our kids also tend to be disproportionately poor that are child welfare and juvenile justice involved. We also have LGBTQ youth that are involved, and so that's a different layer of how to approach their needs and how to ensure that they're being connected to any and all services that could assist them. And then a lot of our kids end up having behavioral or mental health needs, and so how do we meet those needs as well? So it's like multi-layered when you're thinking about it and the types of services that we have to ensure are being offered. So these are some general information that we know about kids that are involved in the child welfare system. For a lot of them, they've experienced trauma. And as we all know, trauma will affect the brain development, and it could lead to behaviors, acting out behaviors as they get older. And what we find is that when they act out in school, what happens, right? They're getting in trouble. Outdoor suspension. Sometimes they're getting arrested on school grounds for behaviors that are either a manifestation of their disability or just childhood behaviors that in the past principals would handle, and now they're letting school resource officers handle. We have behavior related to trauma during childhood tends to not be distinguished from other mental health needs or from delinquent behavior. So we're having kids mislabeled. And we're having kids being forced to participate in services that perhaps are not needs specific, but it's that cookie cutter knee-jerk reaction. We have kids placed in foster care are 3 times more likely than kids who are similarly situated, right? All things being equal, but for the child being placed in foster care, to also ultimately become involved in the juvenile justice system. And so as we move forward in the work that we do and the advocacy that we do, we have to understand how that plays out, and then what do we do in order to advocate on their behalf in a more comprehensive nature. We also find that national research truly indicates that when you have placement instability, that also has a deleterious effect on the child's emotional and mental development as well. And so how do we make sure that we advocate for the stability of the child when they're in foster care? So I've only been, preface to say, I've only been in Massachusetts 9 months. So I've been trying to do the research with with reports put out locally. And based on the reports that I've reviewed, what it's showing is that 85% of the youth that are arraigned in court are actually accused of low-level nonviolent crimes. And I would make the argument that this is pretty common anywhere you go. Pretty common. You know, back during the Clinton era, there was that super predator mentality where every child is committing these heinous crimes and we have to put them all behind bars. And we had kids getting caught up in the system that never belonged there to begin with. You know, we know better now. So what we're also finding in Mass is that we have about half of the teens that are in detention center are there for a misdemeanor. It's not a serious offense. We're talking about petty theft, trespassing, shoplifting. Now, I know that Massachusetts has done really good in keeping our status offenders out of detention, which is great, but that's not happening across the U.S. In some jurisdictions, you have kids who a status offense is something that would not be considered a crime if committed by an adult. But all of a sudden, a youth, like truancy, is a status offense. So, like, you have to ask yourself, the child is truant. So we're going to pick them up and put him in detention for being truant. And all you're doing is allowing the child not to go to school. So it's like, it doesn't make any sense. So I'm glad to hear that Mass doesn't have that issue, but it still exists in other places. So in the data that I was looking at, as it applies to calendar year 2016, we actually had 1,859 detention admissions in Mass, and 21% of those detained youth were actually females, which is the least talked about juvenile justice involvement, you know, among all the kids, right? So we don't tend to talk about female youth offenders as much as we do about males or Black males versus Hispanic males. But it's a growing number across the nation, are the number of females becoming involved with the system. And once again, they were mostly held for crimes against a person or property, but not a heinous crime like murder, right? You're talking about petty theft and things like that. And then what we find is that there's a grid level when you get detained, and most of the youth were assigned a 2 for like operating under the influence, right? Whether they were under the influence of liquor or drugs, possession of heroin, assault and battery, tagging. We all know what tagging is, right? With like the spray paint, and then breaking and entering. But yet they sit in detention. So when we look at the breakdown even further, we see that, as I indicated before, that youth of color tend to get more involved in the juvenile justice system. So in Mass, while youth of color make up about 33% of the youth population in the state, they're under 40% of the 33% of the kids are arrested. Then 60% of them tend to be arraigned. And then 66% of those then end up being detained pre-trial, or may have a probation violation, which as a criminal defense attorney, we call it catch and paper, right? It's like you committed something when they went and checked on you. And then 68% of those are ultimately committed to the Department of Youth Services. I think one of the most striking things, being a Hispanic female, is that since 2012, Hispanic youth have actually accounted for a larger proportion of the youth in detention in comparison to Caucasian or African-American youth in detention. And so I actually attended the Juvenile Justice and Child Welfare Conference this past Friday, and they had a striking bit of information. So they said that while we're seeing, as it applies to dually involved youth, right, kids in foster care as well as juvenile justice involvement, while we're seeing across the board a decrease in the number of dually involved youth, especially among African Americans and whites, we're seeing a continuous increase in the number of Latino youth that are dually involved. And I believe the percentage they gave is, in the past 2 years, it's risen now to like 85% of the kids that are dually involved are Latino youth. In calendar year 2016, we actually had 726 detention admissions solely of Hispanic youth, in comparison to 523 admissions of Caucasian youth, right? And sometimes people say, well, that's because maybe they committed, more infractions than Caucasian youth. But what you have to look at is the totality of the population, and then how each ethnic or racial group, what percentage they account out of that whole population, and then see the subset of how many of that percentage that they account for the whole are actually getting picked up. And when you make that comparison, they're getting picked up at a higher rate. So now we come to the dually involved youth. As I previously indicated, Black and Latino youth always end up disproportionately involved in the juvenile justice system as well as the child welfare system. What we find across the board is when you have a Black youth, and I say Black because you can say African American, but then you end up ignoring the Blacks that exist in other countries that are actually residing in the state of Massachusetts or anywhere else. So for instance, I'm an Afro-Cuban, right? And so you have Afro-Dominican, you have Afro-Puerto Rican, but we're not African American. And so that's why we normally say Black or Black/African American, just to clarify that. So Black youth overall have a greater likelihood than white youth of being diagnosed with disruptive behavioral problems, even though there's no indication that any racial or ethnic differences exist according to a parent or a clinician's rating of behavior. So like all things being equal, the only thing that makes a difference is the color of their skin, is what some studies find. We also find that we have this overdiagnosis of disruptive behavioral problems in many instances. And when you have this overdiagnosis, what it does is it increases the number of referrals, not only to the juvenile justice system, but also in the school to the school counselor, or even, here's a perfect example. So before becoming a lawyer, I was actually a special education teacher, and I oversaw the special ed program at a middle school. And sometimes, my thing was mainstream my kids. My kids don't need to be in a self-contained class. They should be mainstream. But sometimes the teachers that oversaw the classroom where my student was in, they have to know the IEP exists, but sometimes that kind of buries like some sort of bias in the back of their mind where they lose patience for that particular youth. And so it was like if two kids were acting out, no matter what, it was always my student that got the harsher punishment. Mm-hmm. And 9 times out of 10, my student was also a minority student. And so you had that intersectionality of disability and minority coming into play. When all things being equal, they were both equally at fault. But my student always ended up getting the worse or the harsher punishment. And so we find that also when it comes to referrals and just getting pushed into the juvenile justice system. As it applies to Latino youth within Massachusetts, I've already said this, we've seen an increase in out-of-home placement. So here, in one of the data that I looked at, it's 82%. On Friday, they said 85% just between 2017 and 2018. So, and this is, obviously it's having an impact on the Latino community. And, it's going to get to the point where it's a majority minority. And so the question that needs to be asked is, why is this happening? Like, what are the underlying factors that are causing this to happen? No one had an answer on Friday, but that's a question that all of us as service providers and as advocates need to ask ourselves if we're seeing these numbers within the kids that we represent, and we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, why is this happening? So if we look at some of the specific data here in Mass, what we find is that placement instability is always a key risk factor for juveniles. Unfortunately, in Mass, we have a particularly high rate of placement instability, but don't think we're alone, because we're not. So placement stability, based on a definition, means if a child's in foster care, they've had 2 or less placements. I've never handled a child welfare case where a child has had 2 or less placements. Never. And I've been doing child welfare work actively or inactively for 15 years. In Mass, we average about 3 placements in a child's history. That's the average, right? You can have it higher or lower. When we looked at calendar year 2016, the percentage of detention admissions of youth with DCF involvement was 42.5%. And then between 2012 and 2016, the percentage of detention admissions of youth with DCF involvement went from 37.2 to 44.5% here in Mass. So a subgroup of that is kids who are becoming involved in the Massachusetts court system are also presenting with mental health concerns, right? So that's like an added layer that you have to work with as an advocate. It's not only has the child been removed from the home, child suffering trauma, child's in foster care, sometimes the foster parents and the child click, sometimes they don't. Then you have, did the child also now pick up a charge in juvenile court? But then on top of that is, how does that trauma manifest itself? Is it an emotional instability? Is it a mental health instability? Is it a combination? And then what's the best service model that the child can, flourish under? And is there a model? Is it a one-size-fits-all? Or should it be an individualized plan? Right? Especially under special ed. So the mental health advocacy program for kids actually did a study, and they were following 156 children who were served by MHAP, who reached court on a delinquency matter or a child welfare matter. And what they found was 83% were diagnosed with one or more mental illnesses, which an average of 3.5 mental health related conditions. 3.5 related conditions for children under the age of 18. What does that say? What are we doing to our kids, right? You have 89% of them have a barrier to mental health treatment. Whoa. 63% had access crisis or an emergency mental health care system in the past year alone, based on this study. 63% are having a crisis. What are we doing? Like, where are the services? 44% had been hospitalized for psychiatric care in 1 year. Psychiatric care. 37% admitted to a residential mental health facility in that year. 28% didn't attend school or missed almost every day in the 3 months leading up to the study. And 61% missed school more than 1 day per week in the past 3 months leading up to this. It's a disservice. Our kids are missing out. And what we find is that the longer that they're out of school, the longer that they fall behind academically, the less engaged they are with school, and the more likely they are to what? Drop out. And so it's all these different factors that come into play that truly makes any advocate's job extremely difficult, because you have to try to put all these pieces together and try to get some personalized treatment plan for them. So what we're seeing within Mass is we have kids that are unable to access culturally competent mental and behavioral health care, right? And so if you're unable to access culturally competent care, where maybe the care is being offered in your home language, your parents are being brought into the fold of the behavioral health plan to ensure that the parents are also contributing, and they also have the ability to participate in their home language. Let's say the person who's actually giving the evaluation is culturally competent in the sense that they can either deliver the test in your home language, or they understand the validity of the test and how it applies to your cultural group, right? If you're missing any of those pieces, then some of your results may be a bit biased in general. We're having the inability to access community-based mental health services. And this is across the board. You know, we talk about keeping kids out of juvenile justice and allowing them to access services in the community. But if the services that are in the community are cookie cutter and they're based solely on the needs of one particular group within the community, then it's not going to be as effective. If the other groups that are accessing it are unable to understand the requirements under that service provider, or they approach things differently and the service provider fails to understand why that approach is in meeting their check marks. So we need to be better at making sure that we have therapists, that we have psychologists, that we have clinicians available who are culturally competent and trained in the area of treating kids who've been exposed to trauma, but who also, and I love this term, right? Because we always talk about cultural competency, but we also need to have cultural humility. And what do I mean by that? It doesn't matter what or how or who trains you, you're never going to know everything. And as I indicated earlier, we are a hodgepodge of so many different things. So I, being Cuban, I was born in Cuba. You could say, well, Cubans are X, Y, or Z, but we're not. So maybe the foundation from the 60s when we first came here and we were trying to hold on to our culture remains the same. But as we integrate with other community members, we have all those multiple layers of experiences that build out who we are. And so we need to acknowledge within ourselves that we're not going to know everything there is to know. And we need to be humble about that and open ourselves up to receive the information that's being provided.
Can I just ask a question at this point?
Sure.
What recommendations might you have for finding more culturally competent therapists?
I'm not going to lie. That's a very difficult one. And my personal opinion is that we need to start at the college level. And for those of us that are service providers, work with the colleges to make sure that we're bringing students into the social work program, the counseling program, the psychologist or psychiatrist program, even in medical school, who bring their own personal experiences to the table, right? Mm-hmm. That come from minority groups that speak the multiple languages and that are also being exposed to other communities, so that they can expand their ability to understand and receive the information that's being given. We need to be forward-facing about asking for that. If you're a surrogate parent and you're at the table during an IEP, and you know that the parent's ability to, their culture, their background is different than the expectations from everyone else at the table, then you should speak up and request someone, right, that has worked with this particular population, or that has experience in working across the board with all families from different walks of life, because they're going to bring that experience to the table. You also should try. So for an example, when I was in Washington State, I was monitoring some of my grantees out there, and I met with a Spanish-speaking psychologist that was involved, that did the evaluations for kids coming into the Juvenile Justice Program. And there was a high population of Spanish-speaking families residing in that jurisdiction. And he said, I'm one of a dozen, and I'm the only one that's bilingual. And I'm the only one who can, who understands the intricacies of the Latino community. And I'm burnt out and I'm about to leave, mm-hmm. right? And so that's beyond anything that I could do or you could do. But collectively, when we speak to our elected officials, when we speak to our school board, we need to let them know that this is important. Across Massachusetts, we have multiple cultures represented. Mm-hmm. And it's a disservice to those families that require the services if they don't have anyone that they can speak to in their home language, who might understand how they approach someone in authority, right? Because what we find is in some cultures, a person of authority is viewed as the be-all, end-all, and so the parent will never speak up because in their culture is deemed as disrespectful. Mm-hmm. And so they fail to advocate for their child, and nobody knows their child better than the parent. Right. And so collectively, we need to be aware of the fact that we don't have enough therapists and service providers that are familiar with the different cultures that they're serving, that are familiar with that can speak the language or can at least understand the parameters of expectations within the households. So we need to ask for that at the table, wherever you're at. Ask for it at the table, advocate for it, work with your schools to try to get kids in high school to become interested mm-hmm. In these areas, to get them to go to school and study and be there for their communities. And most importantly, I think for any minority, it's taking the pride of who you are, right? And being proud of who you are and what you bring to the table, and advocating for those in your community. We always tend, 9 times out of 10, it's like, well, someone else will do it. No, we all have to do it because our kids depend on it. And that might not have been the answer you were looking for, but
no, I just know from experience it's very difficult to try and find therapists that speak a second language,
yep,
that understand the cultural competency and are trauma informed.
Exactly. It is very difficult. And until folks at the helm that are directing some of these systems start understanding that more, I think the difficulty will remain. It's important for the schools and the universities to understand the need for that, and some do. Some truly do. But then it's, how do we motivate our youth to understand that you can do this, and you have the ability to do this, and it's not just X and Y that can do it. Anyone can, and we're here to support you. So also providing that educational support to transition from high school to college, I think will ultimately motivate other young men and women to get into this field. Okay. But it's a spectrum of things that need to happen. It's not just one thing. But I've taught high school in an inner city where the kids were used to hearing, yeah, you don't have the ability to do that. And so we also need to show our kids that they do, and they can, and they will, and they'll be successful. And then hopefully they'll be enamored to go into this area and help others.
One other question from our audience is, given the statistics, why would DCF refuse to recommend a trauma evaluation for a child in their custody with trauma? Good question, huh? It is a problem getting a trauma evaluation for a kid in DCF, yeah.
So is it because they just don't have enough evaluators that have that background?
I think more it also comes down to what's the purpose and what the finances are.
Well, sadly, the finances, but finances should not dictate the need of a child and the delivery of services. I don't have an answer for that. On its face, as an attorney, if I were representing the child or even the parent who's actively involved on behalf of the child, I would argue until I was blue in the face that this is necessary, because otherwise you're just perpetuating the same old, same old. So if we don't get to the bottom of the needs of this child, how trauma is informing the outbursts or any of the educational, emotional difficulties that exist, then we won't be able to prevent this. And my pet peeve is that we as a system end up feeding the back end of the system and not the front end of the system. And what I mean by that is, if you provide trauma-informed care, if you provide, a multi-layered approach to the needs of the child and the family, then you can prevent whatever behavior is being exhibited from escalating to the point where the child ultimately ends up in juvenile justice or even criminal justice. And so we need to stop thinking about building facilities and harness some of that energy and money to provide the services that are required. And so I think that ties in with your first question. It's like we need to continue pushing. We need to educate not only the folks that are running the systems, but the judges, the elected officials, and advocate on behalf of our kids, because trauma informed not only manifests itself in behavioral issues, but it also manifests itself in behaviors or needs that fall under IDEA. And so if you can make that connection that this child requires special education services and that IDEA should be playing a role here in the delivery, then maybe you can use that to a certain degree to try to get some of those evaluations done. So that's a way about it.
All right, great, thank you.
You're welcome. So what does the data show us? I think I already touched on this, right? It's like, how does bias play a role in how we serve kids, youth, and families? And we need to understand, as I previously indicated, right, that we are a combination of so many layers. You know, we come from diverse cultural backgrounds. We have linguistic diversity, racial, socioeconomic, all of that put together, including so many other things, make us who we are, right? And so when I say that, it's like when we're dealing with a family and or a child, we need to keep that in mind, right? We have multiple layers, and we have to get past our assumptions. So for instance, here's a basic assumption, right? I told someone recently, oh, I'm so proud of my child, hit a home run at the game last night. And they're like, really? That's great. How did Matthew that? I'm so happy to hear Matthew did that. But it wasn't Matthew, it was Amanda, right? Because we have that assumption that as soon as someone hits a home run, we immediately associate that with a male. Or if I was like, my son, you know, I can say my child performed last night on the Nutcracker. And it's like, oh, that's great for her. No, it was really a he, right? So those are the differences. So we need to get past assumptions that we make. Here's a personal assumption. I used to work in South Carolina, and I get a call from someone in the field saying, where are you? And I'm like, I'm at X, Y, and Z place. And they're like, oh, just saw on the news that these 2 Hispanic women got into a fight on the steps of the Capitol. And I was wondering if you were one of them. And so, you know, like the first thing that comes to mind is, okay, so you think we're all hotheads, because that's really where this person was going. And then it's like, there's only 2 of us. And so there are these assumptions that you make that just are mind blowing. And we need to get past that. And we all make that mistake because every single human being brings their own little implicit bias to the table. But half of the way to solve that problem is to admit that you have implicit biases, that they all live within us, and then try to get past that. And that leads to, you know, we have these beliefs, values, customs, and languages that are unique to each person. So that's great, right? But then it can also work against you, because when I meet someone, I'm bringing my own beliefs, culture, values to the table. And sometimes we tend to judge others by our own internal system that may not necessarily align with theirs. Mm-hmm. And so we have to, you know, what you value in X, I may not value in X. That doesn't make me less than. It just makes me different. And when I say to open up to one another, that's how we learn. You know, the last 2 years that I worked at Department of Justice, I actually worked in the Community Relations Service, and CRS is America's Peacemakers. And what we do is we deploy during times of civil unrest. We deployed during Ferguson. We were on the ground at the after the Charleston 9 massacre, et cetera, et cetera. But the one thing that we always did when we had community forums and we brought individuals from the community, elected officials, et cetera, is listen. Listen to understand, not to respond. Open up and receive what's being said. You may not necessarily agree with it because, once again, we're bringing our own predispositions. But if you open yourself up, then you can at least understand where they're coming from and what their needs are as they see it, not as we want to see it. And that's something that we as service providers also need to keep in mind. So it ties into our unique experiences, acknowledging our biases, and how all of this translates into the real world and the work that we do. So we tend to form these social stereotypes about certain groups of people. And this is a perfect example of how we bring those stereotypes sometimes into the foster care system, mm-hmm. Where we assume that if it's a Latino child, they're best served being placed in a Hispanic household, right? Or if it's an African-American child, they're best served being placed in an African-American household because they know better. But do they really? Like, what is the need of the child? The child needs to be in a healthy, loving family to feel safe. And folks can provide that. And that was one of the reasons why, well, one of the many reasons why the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act was put in place, because what we were finding was that kids were not being placed in foster care simply because there wasn't a family that looked like them available for that placement. And South Carolina was actually sued. And that's where I worked at for 2 years on the MIPA Act, because there was a young man who had been in foster care placement for years. All the judicial reviews were glowing about the foster placement, but when it turned into an adoption, they removed that young man from his placement and placed him in a brand new family, irrespective of all the bonds and the foundation that had been caused, because this new family was of the same ethnic background as his child and not the foster family. And so that family sued, and ultimately South Carolina was found in violation of the MEPA Act. And one of the things that they discovered as they were going through the files as early as the 1990s is that they actually had swatches of material in the files. And they used these skin tone swatches of material to match the skin tone of the child, the foster child, with the potential placement families, because they thought that made the most sense, right? They also would deny foster care licenses to particular families if they didn't have any child in foster care that was of the same racial or ethnic background. So they had, like, for instance, a Cuban family living in the northern part of the state that wanted to become foster parents, and they're like, well, we don't have any Cuban kids in foster care, so no need, right? And we're bringing these stereotypes and these biases into the work, when what we have to do is, what is the totality of the circumstances? What are the needs of each and every child in care? And how can we best meet those needs with a loving and caring family? One of the other things that we find is when someone wants to take in a child that's non-Caucasian, they put all of these additional requirements in, because they assume that because you're Caucasian, you're not going to be able to handle that. So if a Caucasian family wanted to take in an African-American child, they would say, all right, on top of everything else, you also have to learn how to do the child's hair. And so now you're discriminating, right? Because you're singling out one out of many. And so the DOJ and HHS, Office of Civil Rights, pretty much said, if you're going to offer hair care class, it has to be offered to everybody or no one. You can't distinguish one from the other. So we have to stop categorizing people using limited sources of information. And then when we do receive information, we have to make sure that we're properly informed in order for us to move forward. And so some of the biases that I've personally seen in my work is we see a large rate of kids being pushed out of daycare, and those kids end up being African American. In Florida, where I practiced law for many years, we actually had a little girl arrested in kindergarten in Avon Park, Florida, because she was throwing a temper tantrum. So they called the cops, and when the cops came in, she sees these big burly men with guns, and so she hides underneath the table, and they drag her by their feet, and she's kicking and screaming, and they put her in the back of a police car. And because you can't handcuff a 5-year-old, when they put her arms behind her back, they actually placed the handcuffs on her biceps in order to keep her arms behind her back. And she was seated in the back of the squad car for 2 hours until her mom came to pick her up. And the sheriff gave a press conference a couple of days later, and his attitude was, this isn't the first time I arrest a 5-year-old. I knew what I was doing. And the whole thing was that rather than stopping and saying, what is going on with this particular child at this particular time, there tended to be a tendency to treat children of color differently than Caucasian children in that particular school district. And this was one of those accounts. We also have, and this happened to me personally, right? So my kids have a Spanish surname because their father has a Spanish surname. And for both of them, when they started school, they immediately, test them to see if they qualify for ELL just because of the surname. And they call me and they're like, we tested them and they don't qualify for ELL services. But it's like the surprise in their voice. And it's like, just because the surname is Hispanic doesn't mean they need the service. So that's another example of a bias. Or when we talk about ethnicity or race playing a role, which is the MEPA example that I gave before. So this is just to say, like, I give you all of this background to kind of show you how a bias may manifest itself and how the systems came to exist. And then to hopefully to show you how bias can appear in the entire spectrum of special ed, juvenile justice, and child welfare. What we find in juvenile justice specifically is there are 9 points of contact with the justice system. And at each and every point of contact, starting with when an officer stops you, there's bias, right? In the classroom, your teachers will present with bias. Your counselor, your principal. And so as a surrogate parent, how do you get past that? And how do you advocate on behalf of the student to make sure that you have a comprehensive approach to the needs of that child? And I think you start from making sure that if the child needs an evaluation, it's someone who knows the home language, who is either culturally competent or has received or has some sort of experience working with parents and students from that community. If your child is also involved in the foster care system, please make sure that they don't delay permanency for the child based solely on the fact that in their mind, they're trying to find the best fit that would ultimately violate MIPA. Make sure that the parents are always at the table. The parent knows what's wrong. The parent knows what they need. If they're close to their, I've met some parents that truly were not vested in their child's well-being. That will happen. But for those that are vested, they should be at the table. They should have a voice. And even though you're serving, as a representative of the child, it behooves the child to have their parent at the table. Mm-hmm. And it behooves the system to get everyone's opinion. And if the child is older, I like to ask for the child to be at the table, especially if I feel that the child presents with a level of understanding of what their needs are. Like one of the greatest arguments that I ever had with my child was, she's like, you don't listen to me. You don't, like you keep telling me that I don't know what I want, but I do. And if you stop, right? Because we have that, once again, it's my culture, right? Like I'm the parent, I know better, blah, 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 blah. But if you stop and you think about it, my child was able to tell me the difficulties she was having in school. And she was ultimately able to voice what her best learning skill was. And so she could tell me, I need to see it in order to absorb the information. And the teacher doesn't want to listen to me. And so I was able to advocate on my child's behalf because she was able to realize what worked for her. And so I think as surrogate parents, we need to have those conversations with the kids we represent and bring their voice to the table if they themselves are unable to sit at the table.
Great. I have a question. If a parent's culture believes that the teacher knows best, how can we practice cultural humility and also get them to participate?
So that's a perfect question because I've seen that happen, right? And the parent will say, la profesora, it's the professor, right? Or in some countries you call them la doctora, the doctor, because they're considered a doctor, right? An educator is a doctor in their culture. And so it's like, you're absolutely right. They understand the different theories as it applies to delivering information, but you are the doctor as it applies to the needs of your child. And so they need to also learn that. The teacher needs to learn that. And so it would be great for you to actually have those conversations with the teacher. They're not going to view it, one would hope, as you trying to interfere in their teaching capacity. They're going to welcome what you're bringing to the table because 9 times out of 10, teachers want the best for their student. And so it's getting the parent to understand that, yes, the teacher is the expert as it applies to theory, but the teacher is not an expert as it applies to the needs of your child. And so it's having those conversations. But at the end of the day, we're only successful when we build relationships. So I just can't come in cold turkey through the door and expect the parent to listen to me and do what I tell the parent. I myself have to build that relationship. Teachers have to build relationships. As a surrogate parent, you may have the ability to do that. As an attorney, you should build relationships with the parents you represent because it's through the building of relationships that we build trust. And when we build trust, then that person is open to receiving what we're offering. But without trust, they just view it as you meddling in their lives or you not knowing any better.
Right. Are you aware of any programs that would help students of different diverse communities go into the mental health field, or any scholarships that might be out there?
I personally am not off the top of my head, but I can ask around and try to see if I can come up with some resources, and I'm more than happy to forward it to you, and then you can share it with the folks that were on the webinar today.
Great. that would be helpful, because I think that a lot of questions come up with for people trying to help kids is how does one break down the years that they've been hearing, that's beyond you. You're not college material. That's
my biggest pet peeve.
And then they get to high school and they're put on vocational tracks as opposed to college tracks.
And that's where the advocacy comes in. From the parent, from a counselor. A child needs to have a champion.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's that champion's duty to advocate on behalf of that child. And so if as a surrogate parent, you can be that champion, then by all means, please do. Sometimes we have some great foster parents that are also great champions, but you're right. If you hear negativity day in and day out for years and years and years, it is so hard to break through that. But we have to continue believing in them, and we have to somehow get them to believe in themselves. Mm-hmm. So it's a never-ending process. It just can't be done overnight either. So
great. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate your coming.
My pleasure.
And that was extremely informative. I'd like to remind everybody that you will receive a follow-up survey, which we ask you to complete. We value the information so that we can provide everyone with the most effective information to support the wonderful work you do in supporting our children. As a quick reminder, please remember to sign up for the January webinar, which is still being finalized. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Have a great day.
Happy holidays.